Black 6, this is Eagle 6. I have contact. Tanks. A lot of them. Grid 73 easting. I say again, 73 easting. I am engaging. He did not wait for permission. 9 M1A1 Abrams tanks. 12 Bradley fighting vehicles. One open stretch of Iraqi desert with a sand haze the color of old bone, sitting 3 feet above the ground, reducing the horizon to a brown smear, where sky and earth stopped being distinguishable from one another. On the other side of a shallow ridgeline, 80 Iraqi armored vehicles sat in prepared fighting positions. T-72 main battle tanks hull down in berms, with only their turrets exposed to incoming fire. BMP infantry fighting vehicles on the flanks covering the approaches with their 73mm guns. Truck-mounted ZSU-23 anti-aircraft weapons turned to ground fire mode, and command tracks tucked behind the heaviest armor. The Tawakalna Division of the Iraqi Republican Guard had spent weeks building this defensive line. They had surveyed every approach from the south and west. They had assigned each crew a specific sector of fire and drilled it until the crews could execute it blind. They had pre-positioned ammunition at every vehicle. They had anticipated the direction of attack, the timing of attack, the scale of attack. They had prepared for every contingency they could imagine. They had not imagined the thermal imaging system. The engagement that followed lasted 23 minutes. When it ended, every vehicle in the Iraqi position was burning or destroyed. The Tawakalna's entire defensive sector at Grid 73 easting had been eliminated. The most feared armored division in the Iraqi military had ceased to exist as a fighting formation in this sector. Eagle Troop, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, had 0 killed, 0 vehicles permanently lost to enemy fire. This is the Battle of 73 easting, February 26, 1991. It is the most decisive single-armored engagement in American military history. It was planned by a captain who was 28 years old and had never fought in combat. It was fought in a sandstorm that reduced visible light visibility to under a kilometer. It was finished before the heavy American divisions behind it knew it had started. Understanding how it happened and what it means requires understanding the 6 months that preceded it, the specific technology that made it possible, the decisions that defined it, and the man who made the critical choice in the 3 seconds when everything depended on that choice. Begin with August 1990 and the invasion that started everything. On August 2, 1990, 8 Iraqi Army divisions crossed the border into Kuwait at 200 hours local time. Approximately 100,000 soldiers with armor, artillery, air defense systems, and full logistics support drove through the Kuwaiti military in less than 12 hours. By afternoon, Iraqi armor sat at the Saudi border. Kuwait City had fallen. The Emirate of Kuwait, a sovereign state, an OPEC founding member, and the holder of approximately 10% of the world's proven oil reserves, had simply ceased to exist as an independent nation. The geopolitical implications radiated outward in every direction simultaneously. Saddam Hussein now directly controlled 20% of the world's proven oil reserves. He sat adjacent to Saudi Arabia, which controlled another 25%. The international economic architecture, built on the assumption that Persian Gulf oil would flow at predictable prices through stable state arrangements that respected sovereign borders, was suddenly and violently uncertain in ways that affected every government and every economy on Earth. The economic dimension was serious. The political dimension was more serious. A United Nations member state had simply seized a neighboring member state by military force and declared it a province of Iraq. If this was allowed to stand, if the international community absorbed it, negotiated around it, found some arrangement that left Saddam in control of Kuwait, the signal to every other government considering the use of force to resolve territorial disputes was unmistakable. The post-Cold War international order that American policymakers had been describing as a new era of collective security and international law was not yet tested. It was being tested now. President George H.W. Bush decided it would not stand. Operation Desert Shield took 6 months to build. At its peak, 540,000 American military personnel were deployed to Saudi Arabia, supported by coalition forces from 34 nations. The coalition was extraordinary in its breadth. Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, Bahrain, the UAE, Qatar, Oman, Morocco, and Kuwait's government in exile alongside NATO allies, Britain, France, Italy, and Canada, alongside non-NATO partners from Pakistan to Bangladesh to Senegal to Niger. Building that coalition required the most sustained American diplomatic effort since the Second World War. Bush worked the phones personally, calling heads of state in the middle of the night Washington time, making the case for collective action in terms calibrated to each leader's specific domestic political situation. He had served as CIA director, ambassador to China, and vice president. He had built relationships with these leaders over decades of American statecraft. He knew what each of them needed in exchange for their participation, what they needed to say to their own publics, what they needed from the United States in return, where the line was between participation and too far. The coalition he assembled was not simply a military fact. It was a demonstration that the international system that had emerged from the Cold War could function as designed. That collective response to aggression was possible without the Soviet veto that had paralyzed the Security Council for 40 years. The military architecture that supported the coalition was a logistical achievement that American military planners still study, moving 540,000 people, their weapons, their armored vehicles, their food and water, their fuel, their ammunition, their spare parts, their medical infrastructure, and the administrative apparatus that sustains a force of that size in an austere desert environment. Moving all of it to Saudi Arabia in 6 months required the largest sealift and airlift operation since World War II. Supply chains were designed from nothing. Port facilities in Saudi Arabia were expanded beyond their rated capacity. Depot infrastructure was built in the desert in months. The logistics system that kept 500,000 soldiers fed, fueled, and armed was created in real time by an organization that had planned for this kind of operation for 40 years and had never actually executed it. It worked, and then, on February 24, 1991, it moved north. General Norman Schwarzkopf's operational plan was built around the oldest principle in the art of war: strike where the enemy is not looking. The deception component was carefully layered. Marine amphibious forces conducted feints toward the Kuwaiti coast, convincing Iraqi commanders that the primary assault would come from the sea, drawing reserves toward the coast. Air attacks and psychological operations across the Kuwait-Saudi border suggested a frontal assault through the Saddam line, the prepared defensive belt the Iraqis had built along the southern Kuwaiti border, drawing attention to the obvious axis. Iraqi operational reserves were positioned to respond to these expected threats. Meanwhile, the actual main effort had repositioned far to the west in a movement of hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of armored vehicles that Iraqi intelligence failed to fully detect until it was too late to reposition to meet it. When the ground war started on February 24th, 7th Corps and 18th Airborne Corps drove north into Iraqi territory itself, into Iraq, not Kuwait, far west of the Kuwaiti border, in a massive, sweeping movement that would swing east and northeast to strike the Republican Guard from the flank and rear. It was the largest armored maneuver since the German operations on the Eastern Front in 1943. 7th Corps was the Armored Fist, 3 armored divisions, the 1st Armored, the 1st Infantry, and the 3rd Armored, and 1 mechanized infantry division, nearly 1,500 M1A1 Abrams tanks, 1,400 Bradley fighting vehicles, supporting artillery and aviation capable of delivering devastating effects across a front of hundreds of kilometers. Leading 7th Corps, screening ahead of the heavy divisions, was the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. The regiment's mission was reconnaissance in force. Find the Republican Guard, determine their exact positions, fix them in place long enough for the heavy divisions to close up and deploy for the decisive engagement. Keep the Corps from driving blindly into a prepared defensive line without warning. At the regiment's eastern flank was Eagle Troop, 2nd Squadron. Captain H.R. McMaster commanded Eagle Troop. He was 28 years old, a West Point class of 1984 graduate who had distinguished himself in ways that mattered to the people paying close attention, not in the conventional metrics that produce smooth career advancement, but in the harder quality of thinking clearly and honestly about military problems that didn't have clean or comfortable answers. McMaster had studied armored warfare the way serious historians study their subjects. He had read Rommel's own memoirs of command in North Africa, specifically the passages where Rommel described the decision-making process in the first seconds of contact, the interval between recognizing an opportunity and acting on it, and the cost of not acting quickly enough. He had read the American after-action reviews from the Kasserine Pass, the February 1943 engagement in Tunisia, where American armor was destroyed by Rommel's forces and where the failures of American command doctrine were documented in painful, specific detail. He had read the analyses of the Battle of Kursk, where Soviet anti-tank doctrine finally produced a defensive engagement the German operational method could not break, and the analyses examined what the Germans had done wrong with equal attention to what the Soviets had done right. He had concluded that the decisive variable in armored combat was time, specifically the interval between recognizing an opportunity and exploiting it. A commander who hesitated, who processed rather than acted, who called up the chain of command for permission to do what he already knew was correct, was a commander who allowed the window of advantage to close. The tactical situation at the moment of first contact was never going to be more favorable than it was in that exact moment. Every second of delay was a second in which the enemy could respond, reposition, reinforce, organize. He had decided before Iraq that Eagle Troop would not hesitate. The 2nd ACR had been pushing northeast through degraded weather for 2 days before February 26th. A sandstorm had moved through the operational area on the 25th and left a suspended haze of fine silt, not thick enough to stop movement, but thick enough to reduce naked-eye visibility to under a kilometer and to eliminate the visual contrast that normally allows the eye to identify terrain features, vehicles, and positions at range. The sky and the ground merged at the horizon in a uniform brownish gray. Nothing provided a visual anchor. At 16:07 hours on February 26th, Eagle Troop crested a shallow ridgeline, and the thermal imaging systems of every tank and Bradley in the formation saw everything on the other side with absolute clarity. This is where technology becomes decisive, and where understanding the specific technology is required to understand the specific outcome. The M1A1 Abrams main battle tank carries a second-generation forward-looking infrared system, FLIR, developed in the 1970s and fully integrated into the Abrams during the mid-1980s Product Improvement Program. The FLIR detects infrared radiation, heat, rather than reflected visible light. Every object radiates infrared energy in proportion to its temperature differential with its surroundings. A vehicle engine running radiates strongly. A vehicle hull, warmed by the day's sun, radiates at moderate levels. Crew members inside vehicles radiate continuously from body heat. In the suspended sand haze that reduced visible light visibility to under a kilometer, the FLIR was entirely unaffected. Infrared radiation passes through fine particulate suspension with minimal attenuation at the wavelengths this system detected. The thermal signatures of 80 Iraqi vehicles, engine compartments glowing clearly, hull outlines sharp, the geometry of the defensive position fully legible, the spacing between vehicles measurable, appeared in the displays of every American gunner and vehicle commander with a clarity that the naked eye could not have achieved in full daylight, with clear skies. The Iraqi T-72 fire control system presented a different picture. The T-72 was a serious weapon. Widely distributed to Soviet client states throughout the Cold War, feared by NATO armor planners, the vehicle of choice for the best-equipped armies in the Middle East. Its 125mm main gun fired a round that could defeat most NATO tanks of the 1970s at combat range. Its armor, while not as sophisticated as the Chobham composite on the Abrams, was adequate against the weapons of the previous decade. The T-72 that faced Eagle Troop at 73 Easting was the best tank the Iraqi military had. Its fire control system was a first-generation passive thermal imager combined with optical sights. Under ideal conditions, clear air, good light, a stationary target at moderate range, the system was adequate. In the sand haze of February 26th, in the degraded light of a late afternoon filtered through suspended particulate, the T-72 gunner's picture was severely limited. Shapes at the edges of their optical range, not clearly identified as tanks, not precisely ranged. Several T-72s fired as Eagle Troop crested the ridge. The rounds impacted around the American vehicles. The Iraqi gunners were working from a degraded picture, shooting at shapes they could barely resolve, at ranges they had estimated rather than measured with their laser rangefinders. McMaster was on the radio in the first seconds of contact. All Eagle elements, this is Black 6, wedge formation. We are going through them. Move now. This transmission is the decision that defines everything that follows. American doctrine authorized the 2nd ACR to halt at contact, report the enemy position, and call for the heavy divisions to come forward and deploy for the assault. The regiment's mission was reconnaissance, not assault. McMaster could have halted, called for corps artillery, requested the 1st Infantry Division to come forward. He chose to advance. The reasoning he later reconstructed was precise. The thermal imaging advantage was real and temporary. Every second of hesitation was a second in which the Iraqi crews could adjust their sights, change their engagement procedures, request guidance from their commanders, reposition to different ground, begin to organize a coordinated response. The advantage existed because the Iraqis did not yet have a clear picture of what was moving toward them. That advantage was burning off at 1 second per second. There was also the physics of the fire control competition. A moving Abrams could fire accurately at a stationary target because the gun stabilization system maintained the aim point regardless of the tank's movement. The T-72, to fire accurately, needed to be stationary. Moving was not simply more aggressive than halting. It was tactically safer because a moving Abrams was harder to range and engage than a stationary one, while the Abrams could engage effectively at any speed. Move through the position while the advantage existed. Deal with everything else as it arose. The Abrams closed range at 40 kilometers per hour. The 120mm smoothbore main gun fires a long-rod kinetic energy penetrator, a dart of dense, depleted uranium and tungsten alloy, approximately 700 millimeters in length, moving at approximately 1,700 meters per second at the muzzle. The penetrator carries no explosive charge. None is needed. At that velocity, the kinetic energy delivered on impact is sufficient to defeat any armor then in service. The physics are straightforward. Kinetic energy is proportional to mass times velocity squared. A 2-kilogram dart at 1,700 meters per second delivers an impact equivalent to a large automobile traveling at highway speed, focused on a surface area smaller than a hand. The gun stabilization system was the critical enabling technology. A gyroscopic stabilizer maintained the gun's pointing direction relative to the target as the tank moved over rough ground at combat speed. A laser rangefinder updated target distance continuously. A digital ballistic computer incorporated range, ammunition type, wind, barrel temperature, and vehicle velocity to calculate the correct aiming offset in real time, updating dozens of times per second. A trained Abrams crew could acquire a target, compute the firing solution, and deliver an accurate first round within 4 seconds of target acquisition, while moving at combat speed over uneven terrain. This is the tactical fact that made 73 Easting possible. The T-72 required the vehicle to stop to fire accurately. Any significant speed destroyed the accuracy of its fire control system's ability to compensate for gun motion. Stop to shoot. Keep moving to survive. Those two requirements were irreconcilable for the T-72 crew. Sergeant First Class Lawrence Foltz commanded the lead Abrams of Eagle Troop's 1st Platoon. His gunner had been tracking a T-72 in a hull-down position, turret exposed, lower hull protected by the berm, since the moment they crested the ridgeline. The range was approximately 1,200 meters. The target was stationary. Its engine compartment glowed in the FLIR display against the cooler surrounding ground, clear as a lighthouse in fog. The round was fired before McMaster's radio call had fully transmitted. The penetrator traveled 1,200 meters in approximately 0.7 seconds. It entered the T-72's turret face, the most heavily armored surface of the vehicle, specifically designed and angled to maximize the probability of deflecting incoming rounds, and defeated it. The penetrator punched through and shed fragments in all directions inside the turret. Inside, the penetrator and the fragments it had created from the armor it traversed struck the propellant charges stored in the autoloader magazine immediately behind and below the crew. In fractions of a second, those charges ignited in rapid sequence. The pressure of burning propellant inside the sealed turret bustle sought the path of least resistance. It found it upward through the turret ring and the hatch openings. The turret, 25 tons of hardened steel, was launched vertically by the explosive pressure of its own ammunition burning beneath it. It was still airborne when Foltz's gunner had acquired the next target. Sergeant David Lawrence's Abrams, positioned further back in the wedge formation, took a T-72 round on the front slope. A crew had managed to identify a shape in their degraded sight picture, estimate the range, and fire. The round struck the Chobham composite armor, layers of steel, ceramic, and classified fill materials arranged in a configuration that American armor engineers had spent 15 years developing specifically to defeat Soviet armor-piercing ammunition. The penetrator was stopped before it reached the interior. The crew felt the impact through the hull as a heavy blow. Lawrence's voice on the radio was level. "Still up!" The formation did not slow. At the flanks, the M2 Bradley fighting vehicles were working through the BMP positions and the softer vehicles. The Bradley's 25mm M242 chain gun, a single-barrel automatic cannon firing at up to 200 rounds per minute, sends M919 armor-piercing rounds through the aluminum armor of BMP infantry fighting vehicles at combat range without difficulty. A BMP hit by a burst of 25mm at 800 meters does not function as a fighting vehicle afterward. The flanks were being stripped of their light armor while the Abrams worked through the T-72s in the center. Inside the Iraqi position, the collapse of tactical assumptions was happening simultaneously at every vehicle. The Tawakalna's defensive plan had been built on principles that worked in the Iran-Iraq War and that Soviet doctrine supported. Prepared positions give the advantage to the defender. The attacker must cross open ground under fire. The longer the attacker remains in the kill zone, the greater his losses accumulate. All true, all valid, under conditions where both sides could see equally. In the sand haze of February 26th, both sides could not see equally. The first indication many Iraqi crews had that the engagement had started was when the vehicle to their left or right exploded. Not caught fire, exploded. Then they looked for the source of the fire. While they searched, they were already being tracked by American gunners who had been on them for 15 seconds. While the Iraqi crew was identifying a target and beginning the engagement sequence, the Abrams had already computed the firing solution and fired. While the Iraqi gunner was watching the reticle settle on a shape, the round was already in flight. Some crews abandoned their vehicles and ran. Some fired blindly in directions that the pattern of burning vehicles suggested. Some fought to the last, kept working the fire control, kept trying to engage shapes in the sight picture, died at their stations doing exactly what they had been trained to do. None of it changed the outcome. At Grid 74 Easting, McMaster called the halt. "All Eagle elements, this is Black 6. Halt at 74 Easting. I say again, halt at 74. Do not cross the boundary. Iron Troop is on our left." The boundary was the limit of Eagle Troop's assigned sector. Iron Troop, the adjacent element, was operating to the east. In the smoke and heat and confusion of a moving armored engagement, Crossing into a friendly sector created conditions for catastrophic, friendly fire. McMaster stopped at the line his commander had established. No further. He counted what Eagle Troop had destroyed. 28 T-72 tanks, 16 BMPs, 39 trucks, command vehicles, and anti-aircraft guns. The entire defensive capability assigned to this sector by the Tawakalna Division. Eagle Troop, 0 killed, 0 vehicles permanently lost. The after-action analysis examined the engagement from multiple perspectives and found something significant. Other cavalry troops in the regiment made contact with Republican Guard forces that same afternoon. The equipment was identical. Training standards were the same. Terrain and weather presented identical problems. The outcomes were not identical. The variance was explained by command decision under time pressure, specifically by the decision to advance rather than halt at first contact. That decision, made in 3 seconds, changed the engagement window in a way that no other decision could have. It meant the first 30 seconds of contact, when the thermal advantage was at its maximum, when the Iraqi response was at its most disorganized, were spent firing rather than processing. McMaster processed quickly because he had spent years thinking about exactly this moment. He knew what the thermal systems could do. He knew what the T-72 fire control required. He understood that the interval of advantage was measured in seconds, not minutes, and he had decided before the war began what he would do when those seconds arrived. When they arrived, he was ready. 7th Corps continued northeast for 2 days after 73 easting. The 1st Infantry Division, the 1st Armored Division, and the 3rd Armored Division completed the destruction of the Republican Guard. The Medina Division destroyed in the open desert, the Hammurabi Division caught in the open trying to escape north and killed from the air. The Tawakalna eliminated sector by sector across the 2-day engagement. President Bush declared a ceasefire at 800 hours on February 28, 1991, 100 hours after the ground war began. McMaster returned to Fort Carson. He wrote his after-action reviews. He began the research that became his doctoral dissertation at the University of North Carolina, completed in 1996 under the title Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Lies That Led to Vietnam. The dissertation examined in precise historical detail how the senior military leadership of the United States during the Vietnam War failed their professional obligation. They allowed a war to escalate on the basis of strategic assumptions they privately knew were flawed. They told the President and the Secretary of Defense what those officials wanted to hear, rather than what the military situation required them to be told. They prioritized access to power, institutional harmony, and their own career advancement over the honest professional military advice that their oath and their position required them to provide. The result was that soldiers died for a strategy that was never going to work, and died for years longer than necessary because the honest assessment of the military situation was suppressed. The book was read at every professional military education program in the country. It made certain senior officers uncomfortable. It was read anyway because the argument it made was correct and the history it documented was real. McMaster commanded the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Tal Afar, Iraq, in 2005. The counterinsurgency campaign he ran there, combining sustained military security operations with governance reform, economic development, and the reconstruction of local political legitimacy, produced results that the Army's then current doctrine had not formalized, but that the situation unmistakably required. The city stabilized. The methods were studied and incorporated into the Counterinsurgency Field Manual, published in 2006. He was passed over for general twice by promotion boards that found his intellectual independence, his written critique of senior military leadership, or his operational methods inconvenient. He was eventually promoted. He was appointed National Security Advisor of the United States in February 2017. Every piece of that career traces to the same quality: the willingness to say what is true rather than what is convenient, and to act on that truth when action is required, rather than deferring to institutional comfort. That quality was not formed in the Iraqi desert. It was built in years of reading, thinking, arguing with his instructors, and developing his own understanding of how armored warfare actually worked versus how it appeared in the field manuals. What the Iraqi desert did was test the quality under conditions that admitted no revision. At 16:07 hours on February 26, 1991, the test was 3 seconds long. He passed it in 9 tanks, 12 Bradleys, 23 minutes, a field full of burning T-72s, 0 killed. The silence that followed a decision made correctly, in the moment when it mattered, by the man who had prepared his whole career for exactly this. You know where to find us. Here is what the analysis missed for 30 years. The Battle of 73. Easting was not only studied inside the American military, it was studied by every military in the world that had reason to care about the future of armored combat, which is to say every military that fielded armor or expected to face it. The Russian military studied it carefully. The tank battles of 1991 confirmed what Russian analysts had been debating since the 1970s. The generation gap between Soviet-era fire control technology and the American thermal imaging and digital fire control systems was wider than Moscow's most pessimistic assessments had suggested. The T-72 that the Russians had exported to Iraq was not the T-72 that the Russian army itself operated. The export versions were deliberately downgraded, but the fire control gap was real in both versions. The Russian response over the following decade was a sustained effort to close that gap, producing the T-90 and eventually the T-14 Armata program. Both programs incorporated thermal imaging and digital fire control as primary requirements, specifically because of what happened in the Iraqi desert in 1991. The Chinese People's Liberation Army studied 73 Easting in its professional military education programs. Chinese military analysts published assessments that focused on the digitization gap, the difference between a military whose armor, artillery, and aviation could share a common operational picture in real time, and one whose units operated in informational isolation. The PLA's subsequent emphasis on C4ISR, command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, as the primary investment priority for military modernization was directly influenced by the 1991 analysis. The Israeli Defense Force, which had more direct experience with Arab armies equipped with Soviet systems than any other military, used 73 Easting as a confirmation of what its own experience in 1973 and 1982 had suggested. Thermal imaging was a force multiplier of the first order, and the Merkava tank's thermal fire control upgrades were the correct investment. Every military in the world that was paying attention drew the same conclusion from February 26, 1991. The side with the better sensor system wins. The conclusion was not wrong, but it was incomplete. McMaster's decision to advance rather than halt was not made by a sensor system. It was made by a human being who had spent years developing a specific understanding of what armored warfare required and who was able to apply that understanding in 3 seconds under fire. The sensor system gave him a picture. He decided what to do with it. This distinction matters because the post-Gulf War, American military tended to draw a specific lesson from the conflict. That technology was the decisive variable. The revolution in military affairs, the concept that dominated American defense thinking through the 1990s and into the 2000s, held that information technology, precision strike capability, and sensor superiority had fundamentally changed the character of war in ways that favored technologically sophisticated forces regardless of numbers. The lesson was partly right. It was applied too broadly. The technologies that produced 73 Easting, thermal imaging, digital fire control, composite armor, were decisive in a specific scenario. a conventional armored engagement in open terrain between forces with a significant technology gap, where the technologically superior side had the initiative and the tactical acumen to exploit it. The same technologies did not produce the same outcomes in Fallujah in 2004, where the engagement was not tank versus tank in open terrain, but infantry versus infantry in urban close quarters. They did not produce the same outcomes in the Korangal Valley in Afghanistan, where the engagement was not an armored formation in the desert, but dismounted infantry in mountain terrain. The technology gap that was decisive in the Iraqi desert was not the decisive variable when the environment changed. McMaster understood this. His time in Tal Afar in 2005 was partly an expression of his understanding that the technologies and methods that had dominated the 1990s and early 2000s were not applicable to the counterinsurgency problem Iraq had become. He was right again. The broader lesson of 73 Easting, the one that McMaster himself drew and that his subsequent career expressed, was not that technology wins. It was that understanding the specific requirements of the specific problem you are actually facing and matching your methods to those requirements, rather than to the methods that worked in a different problem, is the foundational competence of military leadership. In the desert, on February 26th, the specific problem was an armored defensive position with a degraded optical fire control system in a sand haze that eliminated visible light advantage, facing an attacker with superior thermal imaging. The correct method was aggressive advance at combat speed to exploit the thermal window before it closed. McMaster understood the problem and matched the method to it. 3 seconds, 23 minutes, the field full of burning armor, the lesson that the after-action review, the military colleges, the foreign intelligence services, and 30 years of subsequent analysis all draw from the Battle of 73 Easting, is about technology. That lesson is real. The lesson that McMaster himself drew is about something harder to teach and harder to measure: the relationship between years of deliberate preparation and 3 seconds of correct decision under fire. He had spent a decade preparing for those 3 seconds. They came. He was ready. You know where to find us. One more thing deserves to be said about the Battle of 73 Easting, and it is rarely said. The Iraqi soldiers who died in those burning T-72s were not incompetent. They were not cowards. The Tawakalna Division was the best armored unit in the Iraqi military, and the men who crewed those tanks and BMPs were professional soldiers who had survived 8 years of war against Iran, a war in which they had faced Iranian human wave assaults, chemical weapons used by their own government, and the full brutality of industrial-age attrition. They had earned their positions in the Republican Guard. They had drilled their gunnery and their defensive positions and their communications. None of that mattered on February 26th. The technology they faced was a generation ahead of what they could see, engage, or respond to in the time available. They were professionals operating a system that had become tactically obsolete, without their knowledge or their fault. Military professionals study this too, because the question that Tawakalna soldiers could not have answered, and the question every military in the world was asking after 1991, was, how do you fight an adversary whose sensor advantage means you never know the engagement has started until the vehicle next to you explodes? The answer that has evolved over 3 decades is not entirely satisfying. You disperse, you hide, you deny the adversary the masked target that the sensor advantage is most valuable against. You use terrain and concealment and electronic deception to deny the clean thermal picture that Eagle Troops gunners had at 73 Easting. The answer is to not be in the Iraqi desert in February 1991, hull down in a prepared position, waiting for a threat you cannot see. That answer has implications for how armies are organized, how they move, how they fight, and how they think about the relationship between preparation and flexibility. It is still being worked out. It was first posed definitively on a ridgeline in the Iraqi desert on February 26, 1991, at 16:07 hours. You know where to find us.